of you and other people in the room have worked together in the distant past, in the last century. I was in Hong Kong for about 8 years, but as you can see, although I'm a permanent resident, I'm not Chinese. And to my shame, I'm not fluent in Chinese, indeed I can't speak Chinese. So this is an outsider's view. Because I'm white and middle class, I was labelled as an expat. If I'd been brown or yellow, I would have been a migrant worker. Astonishingly enough, the expats retain, long after the end of the British Empire, they retain an extraordinarily privileged social position. So I'm not exactly reporting from the front line here. Physically, I'm a bit too old for the front line in Hong Kong anyway. So this is the views of an outsider. What I intend to do is talk very briefly about the background to the current crisis. I've discussed some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses of the movement. I'll look at some of the most recent developments, in particular the impact of the coronavirus outbreak, which has changed the political structure in Hong Kong, not in the way you might think. And I'll try to give a very brief summary of what I see as the main lessons, because we were encouraged by Ian to try and see how this might relate to broader global troubles. So first of all, how Hong Kong works. It's an extreme form of free market capitalism. Every year, the American Heritage Foundation, which is an extreme right-wing propaganda body, think tank, I suppose it would call itself, rates every country in the world as to how free the market is. And for the last, I think, 25 years, Hong Kong has been number one, the freest market in the world. That's not entirely true, which is why there are scare quotes around the free market bit, because actually it's highly concentrated, very oligopolistic, lots of collusion between the very small number of leading capitalist enterprises, about half a dozen, most of which are rooted in property speculation, which have supermarkets, have telecommunications, have a whole range of activities. It's a society, as you might expect, characterized by really grotesque social inequality. I think the only countries in the world which come near having the same Gini coefficient are Brazil and mainland China, which gives you some sense that these are huge inequalities. But because it's a tiny place and the fourth most populous place in the world, you can actually physically see it. You can walk past a row of parked Bentleys and Lamborghinis and see an elderly woman bent over pushing a huge stack of cardboard boxes, which is that's what she spends her days doing, collecting discarded cardboard boxes in order to sell them, because there's no meaningful social security, no meaningful old age pensions, and so forth. So you can physically see social inequality in a way that's actually a little bit more difficult in a bigger country, in a bigger society. It's what you could call a post-industrial, sometimes people might say post-modern society. 50 years ago, if you bought a shirt, it would have been made in Hong Kong. About 25 years, 30 years ago, it would have said made in Shenzhen. Today it would say made in Bangladesh. But Hong Kong went from being a major producer of some low-grade clothing, toys, plastic goods, and so forth, to being a society where the manufacturing makes up 3% of the workforce. So this is a society where there has been a dramatic shift away from manufacturing to services. That means health, it means education, it means very heavily reliant on tourism, catering, and so on. It's a society marked by acute social problems, as again you might expect from the social inequality. The accommodation, I say not house prices, which is what you say in Britain, but flat prices, because flats are tiny, and almost the only, apart from millionaires, you live in a flat. The average flat size, I think, is 400 square meters. sorry, 40 square meters. 400 square feet. Which is tiny. It's really, really small, believe me. Because I was a high-paid expat, my flat's bigger. But very, very high flat prices, and very, very long waiting lists for social housing. There's very limited welfare provision. There are some welfare provisions for old people, but they're very, very limited. There's very limited public housing. They stopped building public housing about 10 years ago. They have started again, but they decided that it was a bit of a socialistic activity, and they didn't like it. And the health services, although actually very good, are enormously overcrowded. I mean, I was stone cold sober when I fell over and broke my leg and my arm. I hadn't had a single drink all day. And I went to the public hospital, and I was treated very, very quickly, but it was enormously crowded, tiny bed space and so forth. So it's a decent health service, but very, very overcrowded, very, very under-resourced. How is it run politically? Well, it's not a democracy. It's run by an alliance of the local oligarchs and Beijing. The capitalists in Hong Kong and the people who call themselves communists in Beijing. There are some elections, but the Legislative Council is gerrymandered. Half of the members of the council are elected by popular vote. One person, one vote. As a permanent resident, I'm entitled to vote. But the other half are elected by what are called functional constituencies, which are basically, well, what are they? They're gerrymanders. So, for example, some of them have maybe 200-300 members, and they elect usually owners of corporations. They will elect a candidate, a member to the Legislative Council, whereas the 70,000 people in Kowloon West will elect one Legislative Councillor. So, a shocking gerrymander, designed specifically to prevent democratic rights. The government and the people behind Beijing and local government have consistently refused to extend genuine democratic reforms. In 2014 there was the famous umbrella movement which was demanding democratic reforms, but that was, to be honest, was defeated. It was beaten. After that there's been increasing political intervention against oppositionists. So, for example, they have first of all expelled people from the Legislative Council for taking their oath wrongly. So, a very famous local leftist, a man called Long-Haired Lung, he has long hair, and he invariably wears a Che Guevara T-shirt. He's a former trot, and still an excellent person. Had been elected to the Legislative Council for years and years and years for the League of Social Democrats, and I think in his when he said it, I swear to blah 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 freedom for Hong Kong, and this was enough to get him disqualified. Other people have been refused the right to the right to stand for election and so forth. In the most recent council elections, one of the most famous leaders was refused the right to stand for the local council. So people have been jailed for spurious offences, public order offences, and policemen who beat people up on camera have been released from prison and so forth. There's been a white terror, as they call it. And there's increased cultural pressure on Hong Kong from the mainland. Not just political pressure, but also cultural pressure. Hong Kong is overwhelmingly a Cantonese-speaking society. Mainland China, there are many languages in mainland China, but the official national language, which is pushed very, very, very hard, is Mandarin, Putonghua, which there have been attempts to force it on Hong Kong schools, on Hong Kong people, and so forth. I remember having an argument with. It doesn't matter, I haven't got enough time to talk about that. Argument with the mainland broadcaster who wanted to reach Hong Kong youth, and I said, well, you've got to broadcast in Cantonese. They won't listen to Mandarin talks. So increased cultural pressure. In other words, Hong Kongers feel their identity is under under threat. And this is, I know this is a contentious issue in UK politics, but I think we have to bite the bullet and say, in this context, a great deal of what has gone on is about identity, about the way in which Hong Kongers see themselves and their position in the world, in contrast to the country of which they are part, mainland China. And I think, parallels with Catalonia, parallels with Scotland, maybe we might think about them. The movement itself, I'm sure you've seen videos of people in full body armour with helmets and gas masks fighting hand to hand with the cops, and the cops firing tear gas and so on. So I won't talk about the details of the battles, except to say that the protesters have been very, very brave, very, very very, very persistent, very, very courageous and enduring. When demonstrations have been permitted, they have been huge. There are some doubts about how many people, the police will say 5 or 10 people, and the organizers will say 5 or 10,000 people. Maybe, it's impossible to say what they were, but Hong Kong has a population of about 7.5 million. And some of the demonstrations have been at least 1 million people, probably more than that. And that's very, very big, a huge proportion of the population. That's 1 in 7, 1 in 4, some people say, which will be a demonstration in Britain of what, 15, 16 million? These are big demonstrations. This is a mass movement, a genuinely mass movement. Much bigger, relatively speaking, than the anti-war movement here, much bigger, relatively speaking, than anything that I think that we've experienced. There have been frequent police bans on completely reasonable and peaceful demonstrations, which are then ignored, and the police then attack the demonstrations. They beat people up, they arrest people violently, they hold them in appalling conditions. They are alleged to have raped at least one young woman in the police station. They are alleged, I don't think it's true actually, they're alleged to have murdered some people in the subway station, underground station. But no, extremely violent police response. These attack these, what they would call illegal demonstrations. Another characteristic of the movement is that it has no agreed leadership. Right. This is something we need to think very carefully about. There isn't a party leading it, yes? It's the reverse of the transitional program. It's organised through discussion, primarily online, but also in face-to-face. You can see videos of people outside the police stations discussing as they throw petrol bombs whether they should move on to somewhere else, or and they reach a consensus about what they're going to do. So it's an example of extreme practical democracy, and it's capable of organising the most extraordinary things. And I don't know if any of you saw, at one stage they occupied the Polytechnic University, which is in my opinion, was a mistake, because it gave, their strength is mobility, and occupying a single place was a mistake. They had the police to surround them, to hold, besiege them, and so forth. Some people were trying to escape, and self-organised. They found there was a bridge, and they found some ropes, and a number of people came on motorbikes, and they shinned down the ropes and got on the motorbikes and were whisked away past the police. It was just without any organisation, without any formal organisation at all. If you go on a mass demonstration, if you're like me, you're not brave enough for the front line, and you're in the mass of the demonstration, suddenly 2 lines will form, and people will be making hand signals. And as a result of the hand signals, these lines will pass for maybe half a kilometre, past helmets, gas masks, umbrellas, water, and so on, down, absolutely spontaneously formed. No outside organisation whatsoever. Really remarkable example of the creativity and self-organisation of the masses. And they have a high level of political sophistication. You will have heard that they trash buildings, yes? They select these very carefully. I'll give you one example. They trash bank branches of the Bank of China, which, the answer is in the name. Yes, this is a mainland organisation. But they'd left HSBC alone. And then HSBC closed the accounts of one of the main solidarity organisations, which has the name of Spark. but it's nothing to do with SPARK. No S on the end. Yeah? HSP closed it in response to police, and now they've just HSBC as a target because it stands on the side of the enemy. Another example, they broke up, they trashed a mobile phone shop because it was China Mobile Hong Kong, China Mobile mainland company, and this elderly guy went into the shop and started looting. He was stopped looting and actually chained to a railing until the police came along and arrested him. Now, you may not like the outcome of that, but it showed that they were consciously saying, look, we are not robbing, we are not crooks, we are making a political point here. So I think, all through, and a whole number of examples, a very, very high level of political sophistication. There are certainly political organisations present. Of course there are. There are the traditional pro-democratic parties. There are the left pro-democratic parties. There are some very, very small revolutionary groups. We were working with one of them. But I think it's important to understand that if you say you're a socialist or a communist in Hong Kong, people think you're pro-Beijing, and they might listen. Yeah? So it's very, very difficult to find an audience for socialist ideas because the term has been completely discredited. Certainly, there are independentists. There are people who want to break from China. Longhair says, and I think correctly, that isn't a solution. China is 1.5 billion, 1.4 billion people. Hong Kong is 7.5 million. If Hong Kong is going to have self-determination, it can only be with the agreement of Beijing. That means the necessity of the overthrow of the communist regime in Beijing. Recently, there has been a possible shift towards terroristic tactics. People have said, look, every week we're fighting the police, we're having a mass confrontation, blah, blah, blah. It's getting us nowhere. What we need to do is have a more secret organisation and blow things up. Now, I'm not sure about this because the people they've arrested, and this could be police provocation, it could be something completely different. I don't know. But, there could be a shift towards a more terroristic organisation. And I think probably most of us would agree that would be a step in the wrong direction. But the whole movement retains huge popular support. You remember you may not remember, there was an election, a local election. You can still build mass demonstrations. And in November there was a local election for local councils. Got no power at all. But it's the only forum in Hong Kong where there is almost entirely democratic elections. There are one or two little fiddles. The government said if you vote for the democratic parties, you'll be voting for violence. And so 60% of the people voted for violence. There was massive rejection of the government candidates, all sorts of horrible people. A man who threatened to sue me and Ian, actually, called Junius Ho.
The Honourable.
The Honourable Junius Ho, yes, that's what he says in his letter to us. The Honourable Junius Ho lost his seat, or rather one of his two seats. Small celebration. I'm sorry about that, but I didn't imagine for a moment that an obscure person like me would come to the attention of Julius. He obviously pays someone to look out for things. The composition of the movement. Well, first of all, it's overwhelmingly young people in the front line. Some of them are very young. The majority are under 30, but some are as young as 11. There's school kids, university students, and young employees. We'll come to the question of who these young employees are later. Very many of them are students and graduates. It's about 60% male, including, how do you know what the composition of the front line is? By the arrests, yes? And about 60% of the people have been arrested for fighting the police. And when I say fighting the police, I don't mean shouting abuse, I mean throwing rocks and being female. So it's predominantly male, but perhaps not as masculine as you might imagine. It's relatively few migrant workers. You'll be lucky. Relatively few migrant workers. I've done this before. Relatively few migrant workers, and Hong Kong has a huge. Well, actually only 8% of its population is migrant. And the largest groups are from Philippines and Indonesia. These are domestic workers who work under conditions of something pretty close to modern slavery. And they have not played a leading role in this, although there has been some support. And people, the mainlanders go around with cameras video cameras to demonstrations, taking photographs of people like me, Guailos, because they want to say that this isn't really Chinese people doing this. This is the American government and the British government. I was accused of being a British spy because they hunted me down on that. So it's just as well, really, that most of the bankers and international lawyers don't go on these demonstrations because they wouldn't add much to the movement, and they would give Beijing a free pass. The support networks, however, contain many, many older people. The vote is one clear example of that, but there are lots of others. I don't have time to go through them. They help organise transport. They provide substantial financial support. Until very recently, there was very little evidence of organised support in the workplace. So this has been largely a movement of the streets. And the general strikes that they have called have been largely token. They haven't really succeeded in stopping many workplaces. And people who have gone on strike, quite a lot of people, have taken a day off, or their boss is sympathetic to the movement and has turned a blind eye. So that has been, if you like, a weakness from our point of view. However, that is, I think, changing. There has been an employers' offensive sacking militants. The great example is Cathay Pacific, which initially attacked Cathay Pacific, which is owned by a British company, Swire, one of whose members is a Tory MP, who had, they'd said, it's none of our business what our staff do during their time off. As long as they turn up on time, fly the planes okay, serve the meals okay, that's what they do elsewhere is their business. Beijing said to Cathay Pacific, you have to make sure that no demonstrators are serving flights flying into Hong Kong, into mainland China. So, a very large chunk of Cathay Pacific's business is either flying to China or flying over China. So the management did a U-turn. They fired a number of senior executives who had been neutral on this question and started to fire people. The most prominent one was the president of the Dragonair Flight Attendants Union. Flight attendants, interestingly enough, are probably the most militant trade union in Hong Kong, which is a sad story which we'll come to later. Not much later. This woman had published a blog saying blah 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 blah, and they fired her. And unfortunately, there was no immediate response. Although the flight attendants go on strike, they didn't strike in defence of her, and they've fired over this. Officially 20, but allegedly 200 people have been fired for their political positions. But other companies have taken up the same thing. One of the reasons why there's been little action is that the Hong Kong Federation of Trade Unions is an obstacle to solidarity. It's what I call a yellow union. It's entirely integrated into the state apparatus. When the Brits were in power, it did play a leading role in the 67 riots against the British, for example. It did build a base out of that. The 67 riots started out of a strike in a toy factory. But today they are entirely incorporated into the league. They run candidates, they go on the National People's Political Coordinating Committee in Beijing, and so forth. They scabbed on the docker strike. one group of dockers went on strike, and they instructed their dockers to continue working. There is a Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions. That's a smaller but genuine union. Its main strength is amongst groups like teachers and social workers. But in the last month, there has been a move towards organising new unions. A large number of new unions have grown up, have started to organise. And this is, I think, people say, look, we've been fighting on the streets, it's getting us nowhere. We'll have more power if we organise in the workplace. So this is, it's the beginnings. Yes, it's not the AFL-CIO, it's not CIO yet. It's not 1936 in Detroit, but it is a genuine movement to organisation, and it's recently had its first victory. And that's to do with rises out of a health emergency. Public health is, of course, a political issue, particularly when there's a public health crisis like the coronavirus. And in Hong Kong, which suffered very heavily 18 years ago from the SARS epidemic, this is a very sensitive subject. And the Hong Kong government was slow to respond to what seems to be a very serious crisis. In particular, the government is reluctant to close what's called the boundaries, the border between Hong Kong and the mainland. I think you can't call it a border because borders are between different countries, but this is between two parts of the same country, they say. And they obviously Beijing didn't want that to happen. Carrie Lam refused to restrict it initially. Opposition to her health policies, the fact that she's not protecting Hong Kong citizens, sits very easily with the fact that that she's devoted enormous time and resources to trying to smash the mass movement. Another example of government incompetence.
Can we finish up the next couple of minutes?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I mean, this is the most important part of the talk. The working class take action and win. Oh boy. This week, there was strike action by health workers. 5,000 health workers went on strike. The demand was close the border. Yeah? Now, that's a bit double-edged because that's partly anti-mainland feeling, but partly xenophobia against mainlanders. But nevertheless, I think in the context of a health emergency, and it was the ancillary workers, not the frontline workers. The frontline workers are treating patients, victims of the emergency. I think it was organised by one of the new unions, and I think it's probably the first big strike, genuine strike, since the defeat of the Confederation's dockers a few years ago. So I think this is a fantastically important development, which is why I wanted to come to it. I think that it's about 5,000 people. They weren't the people actually treating coronavirus victims. They got more sense than that. But they did have wide popular support, and they had a de facto success. The border is now much more tightly closed as a result of this action. So I think the movement is shifting from being a street battle against the government to being industrial action to achieve political ends in this case. And there haven't been any strikes over wages, but this is a strike over a political issue. Okay, I have another slide, but I'll leave it, just to make you happy.
Do we have any very any questions?
Behind you, lots.
Okay, I'm going to take Rachel, and then Willie, and Raja, and if we have time, then Roger.
Yeah, so as far as I understand, the next wave of strikes was voted down. Did you lose the next?
You're better. You're more up to date than I am.
Yeah, I think the vote yesterday was that the strike action was not going to be extended, and he lost it by about 2,000 votes, I think.
Yeah.
I guess if you didn't know, you would have known the reasoning behind that, but it's.
I imagine because the majority thought they'd achieved their objective, which was closing the border.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think it's important that names are important, and remember Marx used to be a Democratic Republican. You can imagine in America calling yourself that. So we're not precious about it if we're trying to get some relationship is that a possibility? What would we be saying to people that we are, that would not put up barriers? Is there a
Depends
just
on
calling ourselves
who we
revolutionists?
are and who we are talking to. I'm reluctantly not a member of any organisation at the moment, despite having spent the vast majority of my adult life as an active member of an organisation, which shall remain nameless. But Pat was in it too. What we did, what Sue and I did, was we couldn't, because we don't speak Cantonese, we couldn't play an active role. We could only talk through intermediaries. The intermediaries who we found, and this was purely fortuitous, a small group called Socialist Action. They are very small, very isolated, and all we could really do was provide them with support when they, for example, there was an attack on some mainland feminists, and Sue spoke at the support rally. They needed to set up a bank account to help organise a school strike, and I set that up. So, for us, it was very much a support role. Yes, we couldn't play a leading role of any kind, even if we'd had the courage. But I think what they tried to do, obviously there are differences. Yes, we can debate the founding of the Fourth International, or the class nature of the Soviet Union, or whatever you like. Yes, but in practice, I think we agree with them pretty much. Yeah, they said, we're internationalists. We're not against mainlanders. We're for talking to mainland workers. We're for a working class orientation here. But unfortunately, because of the whole of the Confederation, because of anti-communism, we find ourselves campaigning around community issues. We find ourselves doing a lot of work with migrant workers, particularly with Filipino and Indonesian migrant workers. I went on a May Day demonstration with a group of Indonesian migrant workers. They're mates, and they are singing "Solidarity Forever" in English. So they do try to reach out. They do want a working class base. I think would say more or less the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take Roger, and then unfortunately I think we'll have to leave other questions until the main discussion.
You had mentioned earlier that...
Sorry, old man, dead.
You had mentioned earlier that it seemed that there was an unspoken code of political decorum, that people were going to be violent, but they weren't going to steal. To what degree is that a reflection of middle class politics, organizational middle class politics, and to what degree is it detrimental for the overall kind of struggle against capitalism?
That's a very, very interesting point. And had I had time for my last slide, I would. I think Hong Kong, because it's actually the labour force of our future. Yeah? Hardly any manufacturing workers, and lots of service workers. Yes, and the advanced capitalist countries will clearly move in separation. Who do we mean by the working class? What do we mean by working class politics? I would say, look at Britain. Who has taken most action in the last 12 months or the last 2 years? University lecturers, junior hospital doctors. Now, maybe we need to start thinking about how to organise these people, and maybe saying that that's a reflection of middle class politics. Actually, I would expect you would have found a similar attitude amongst skilled engineers in Glasgow or Sheffield in 1917 against. So I think we have to start rethinking who we mean by the working class, what we mean by working class action. Yes, I use the term middle class just like you do all the time, but maybe this is something we should discuss because I'm sure people have got quite different views about it. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much.